Probably the first consideration should be the type of fish you're going after. If you're going to Africa for a tiger fish, or you're going for a big freshwater fish, you got to consider the type of fly you're going to be casting, and that's going to determine the size of rod you need. When I say size, it doesn't necessarily mean length. Almost every rod, if you're going to cast any kind of weight, you're going to have at least an 8.5 to 11-foot rod. Most of the time, a 9-foot rod will get you by anywhere in the world. And remember, a rod is a lever, but the big consideration is the fly you're going to cast, how hard does the fish fight, are you going to need to really pull back in fast water? And a lot of this is the backbone of the rod and the type of rod. We're going to be considering all of this in our next tips. Asking me, what rod should I have if I'm going to be a complete fly fisherman? It's easy for me to tell you, because I'll tell you what I have. I have a 2 or 3 weight for light line fishing conditions. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going for a bigger fish, but it's about presentation, something that lands on the water. And I'm going to tell you something, it's much more fun to catch a smaller fish on a light line rod. More important than anything, presentation, how it lands on the water. And let me tell you, if you're going to be using light tippet, and this is another consideration, 6x, 7x tippet diameter, small diameter, the lighter the rod, the more flexibility you have of landing a fish on the size 18 to 24 fly. In other words, a 3 or 4 weight, if you're using a very light tippet, can land a fish faster than you can with a 5 or 6 weight. And the type of 6 weight, a heavier action. And we're going to get into actions and tell you what that's all about. Action really, let me just clarify that right now, is the backbone of the rod. The relationship from the butt to the tip, how much it flexes. And of course, the more it flexes, the lighter it is, usually determines the line size, which is actually matched by weight. Now let's talk about the next rod you're going to need. Well, there's always a need for an 8 weight. 8 weight to me is the next 5 weight. 8 weight can be for Alaska, it can be for throwing bass bugs, it can be throwing streamers, it can be steelhead, and length may determine a rod, what you want to get. A lot of people on an 8 weight may want a 9.5 foot rod, little extra leverage if they're fishing for steelhead. Now, what about saltwater? This is where people get into a lot of trouble. Should I have a 10 weight, 11 weight, or 12 weight? Well, if you had a lot of money, you should have all of them. If you're going after a sailfish, you should have a 14 weight. Now, what is a 14? But let me tell you, if you're only going to go once or twice in your life, you may want to consider renting one from a good dealer, or you may consider just having the lodge supply one. But one thing that's really important, don't ever figure that you're in a hotel in Mexico and you book with a local guide that he's going to have a rod. If you book with Cabela's or Frontiers, a legitimate fishing operator, they're going to make sure that outfitter has a loan rod for you. With the tip is nice and soft. That's one thing I like about this rod. It's a good feeling rod. I like the cigar grip too. I'm a cigar grip type of guy. It only makes good economic sense to put the money in a rod that you're going to use most of the time. Whether you choose a 5 or a 6 weight, you should understand the difference in actions. A faster action rod is a rod that's stiffer, no matter what the line size may be. The slower the rod, the more flex, and consequently, it is called a slower action rod. It usually means it's a lighter rod. It's usually a more forgiving rod and more of a dry fly rod. A lot of people want a rod that will do everything. There's very few rods that'll do that, but if you only trout fish and bass fish, you can probably get away with one rod. And it probably should be a moderate action. Anglers out here in the West, where I'm from, prefer a 5-weight as their everyday rod. Rods they're going to use for about every purpose. Many anglers, however, choose a 6-weight, especially if they live in the Midwest, where they might be going after some bass or bluegill or other warm water species. It all depends. Either a 5 or 6-weight is a good all-around rod. And if you decide to put in some real money for a rod, it should be the rod you use the most. One thing to consider when you look at 5 and 6 weights is the type of action.
Female anglers prefer more slower action to moderate action rods and tend to do better when the grips are smaller and the rod is light. 5-weight seems to be the preferred action, but again, it depends on the type of fishing the female angler wants to tackle.
It will depend on how you cast. If you have a good high line speed cast, or what we call a shooting cast, then you probably would be happy with a faster rod. But if you have a slower cast and need to hold up more line, you're going to want a moderate action rod. This section of my tips is you don't have to spend a lot of money to have a variety of rods. From the rods that Cabela's custom makes that you can get in any of the shops, to the rods that St. Croix make, starting as low as $75 on up to $300 or $400.